With the likes of Bioware and Bethesda dropping the ball in recent years when it comes to RPGs, a somewhat fall from grace when we take their past games into account, such as the amazing Mass Effect, Dragon Age and Elder Scrolls series of games between the two development houses. With the continuing disasters of Anthem and Fallout 76, Obsidian has risen once again to deliver a game similar to the RPGs of yesteryear. With its interesting story, memorable characters and fantastic dialogue and script, The Outer Worlds delivers in what it sets out to achieve. But for all of its positives, it does have a handful of negatives which holds it back from greatness though, holding it back from standing alongside recent RPG classics such as Mass Effect, Dragon Age or Elder Scrolls. For those with Game Pass especially, The Outer Worlds is highly recommended. It borrows elements from past RPGs while setting out to deliver a world with the depth and intrigue of Bioware and Bethesda's best efforts. If you're after an RPG where your choices actually matter, then you need to play this game. But let's dive in and see where The Outer Worlds succeeds most and where further work is needed for any potential sequel. We'll begin discussing the graphics, where The Outer Worlds can look like it was bitten by Borderlands, as the majority of areas, especially the outdoor environments, are bursting with enough colour. It's like Obsidian made it a design choice to see how many different colours they could cram onto the screen at once, and The Outer Worlds is better for it. In modern gaming, we all too often see many games that are blanketed in blacks and browns, and this colourful sci-fi world is a breath of fresh air. Each planet that players visit offers up its own environment to differentiate it from the others, but each continues to impress with its use of colour and environmental features on display, such as the strange flora and fauna, or the sight of huge celestial bodies which fill the sky, plus the odd spaceship that you'll see fly overhead. But on the downside of things, the detail in terms of texture quality can be a little average at times, and even though these open world areas are a decent size, I would have liked to see an increase in detail to really gel everything together and bring the world to life even more. On the upside though, character models are quite good overall. Now, The Outer Worlds isn't going for a realistic look, so think of the characters as having a cartoon-like look about them, but they look very good, detailed, and even more impressively, the lip syncing for the dialogue is better than I was expecting it to be. It doesn't compete with the top tier of games on the market in regards to this, but it gets the job done and fits in with the whole package of what the game is. The detail carries over to the weapons you'll be using in terms of visual detail and the variety in your arsenal. Reload animations are of a high standard, even if some of the firing effects and explosions are nothing overly impressive compared to other games on the market, but I did like how you could zoom in on your weapons and rotate them around, plus get detailed information about them within the menu. Whilst this feature has appeared in other games, it's still good to see Obsidian included here, especially since it's an RPG, and the more information players have about its world and lore just all add to the overall experience. When it comes to the performance though, I wasn't as impressed overall, as even though the game is aiming for 30 frames a second, it consistently drops frames or has some odd frame pacing, as the image never looks smooth, and I found this negatively impacted gameplay more than once, where aiming became more of a chore than it needed to be. My playthrough was on the Xbox One X, and even though The Outer Worlds aims for a 4K resolution on the system, I would have much rather played the game at 1080p with a constant 60 frames. It's definitely playable, but it is jarring if you're coming from other games with greater performance. One area which helped take my mind off this was the fantastic music throughout the game, but just found myself wanting more of it. The most impressive part for me was some of the background music while simply walking around. They reminded me of the show Firefly. There are only minimal cutscenes throughout the game, and the music of them, along with that during gameplay, was all of a high standard. My only gripe, and I'll expand on this next, was that I would have liked to see different types of music with a different tone. Music to accompany action-packed scenes, frantic scenes, somber moments, and triumphant scenes. The lack of these I contribute to the game's story, companions, and mood, so let's discuss that. The story revolves around your character being awakened from cryogenic sleep by a scientist named Phineas Wells. Awakening on your spaceship, you notice other colonists are still in hibernation. As you land on the nearby planet, you soon discover that it and others are home to several different factions, each with their own purpose. And on top of that, mega corporations tend to own and run the different settlements and society as a whole. The story of the Outer Worlds is great, and information is constantly being given to players, even after you've finished the main story. It's interesting, it's enjoyable, and it builds and introduces different story elements as the game goes on, both from the writing itself and the decisions the player makes throughout the main campaign. I was surprised with just how well written the story was in the Outer Worlds, but was even more impressed when it came to the dialogue for all of the characters and the humour and wit which cascaded itself through all of the players' choices and the ramifications many of them had on the world itself. This clever writing is extended to each of the companions which the player can have become a part of their team, and each has a different personality and backstory, and players can also help them with their own individual quests. A special mention goes to the companion of Parvati, who has this innocence and slight hesitation in how she presented herself. At times, she reminded me a little of Kaylee from Firefly, which only made her character even more endearing to me. Some of these companions can also be found outside of the main storyline, so if you're wanting to access all of them, you'll need to be undertaking side quests as well. But being from the makers of Fallout New Vegas and several comparisons being made between the Outer Worlds and the Mass Effect series, mainly due to its sci-fi setting and use of companions, there wasn't a time when I felt the story, choices and the consequences ever reached the heights of the Bioware classics. Part of this is due to the light-hearted mood and tone that the game employs, and to its benefit, the humour mostly hits the mark throughout the game, but I felt that the tone mostly stayed the same throughout, and this made me feel that even though my actions had consequences, it never really hit that deep emotional level that Mass Effect did so well for me, and although I was invested in the story and my choices, the impact of them on the world and characters never really met my expectations. Those moments where you just sit and think about what has happened, or if a choice results in the death of a character. So the story and characters have been discussed, but what is the gameplay like in the Outer Worlds? Well, even by the end of my playtime, I still felt the shooting mechanics always seemed to be floaty and loose, which made me think a similar thought I always had with the newer Fallout games, including Fallout New Vegas. This was an RPG first and foremost, with the feel of shooting these weapons and the movement being a distant second. Those going in expecting gunplay to compete with the heavy hitters of the first-person shooter genre will be disappointed. There is a decent amount of weapons to use, and each will be based around a different ammo type, so carrying different types of weapons is always advisable. But an area that the Outer Worlds heavily succeeds in with its story and gameplay is making sure your choices have consequences. These are the choices where you can wipe out an entire faction, and that's just when it's a part of the story. Players are mostly free to kill any character they wish, and it's in this freedom that gives the gameplay both longevity and fun. The Outer Worlds can often have several ways in completing objectives. Do you go in guns blazing, or do you sneak in and take the enemies out silently? Even if you're prompted by an enemy or NPC, the conversation that happens can go down several paths based upon the skills you have invested experience points in. Many times throughout these conversations, there are chances to persuade, lie, or confront the NPC, which will alter the conversations and the outcomes. Players may choose to play more diplomatically, trying to solve any potential problems between factions through negotiation and persuasion, or you may simply decide to kill any character who disagrees with you. The freedom and number of choices is perhaps the greatest achievement of the Outer Worlds, and where your actions actually matter. Players are also able to acquire items which will allow them to move around restricted areas for a certain time without being detected, although engaging in combat does reduce the time allotted. Being an RPG, there are a variety of skills that players can invest their experience points in each time they level up. I wanted to try and avoid combat as much as possible during my playthrough, so I found myself heavily investing in the likes of persuasion and abilities that could see me avoid conflict unless necessary, but others are free to do the exact opposite or anything in between. Players are also able to create a flat-out stupid character, and whichever way you go, NPCs will react to you through conversations in different ways. For the most part, receiving experience points and increasing your skills are done well, but I would have liked to see even more diversity when it came to different skill trees and abilities. The Outer Worlds also has a perk system where you can choose different ones as you level up, which can help your playstyle as well, or if you're focusing on particular elements, but the game would also offer you additional perks in exchange for a detrimental effect to your character, which may make you less effective when your party is being attacked by a certain type of enemy, for example, or certain skills also not being as effective. With all of the skills and perks available, plus the different choices leading to different outcomes, The Outer Worlds offers a game that will cater for repeat playthroughs. Players will also be able to equip a number of different armor pieces throughout their playtime, but none of them seemed all that interesting from a design perspective. But both armor and weapons can be upgraded either through mods or tinkering with them on the workbench in order to improve their stats, and these will grant your character benefits in certain areas depending on the mod equipped or how you've upgraded the weapon or armor. Your weapons and armor will also degrade over time, and the workbench can also be used to repair your equipment. I found that on the lower difficulty settings, there really wasn't a requirement or need to upgrade your weapons or armor at all, as the game wasn't all that difficult when fighting enemies. And that's one area of disappointment which ties in with the gunplay, and that's of the AI of the enemies, or how there was a lack of intelligence for the most part. Apart from the lack of variety in terms of enemies, oftentimes I would be oblivious to the gunfire when I was a certain distance away from them. Others would continue to follow me, even though I was shooting them right in the face, or their friends. And this is where I wish they were more intelligent. In the circumstances where they found themselves behind cover, it often felt like it was a mistake that they were even there, as if they were always going to be in that position, regardless of whether there was cover there or not. It never really felt like I was fighting enemies that went above anything more than simply being adequate. There were no advanced tactics where enemies would flank you. It often just boiled down to several gunning for my position, and that was it. When checking things out on either lower or higher difficulty settings, I didn't really see much difference, or if I did, it wasn't anything that made me sit back and think how good the AI was in this game, or making me favour one difficulty over another. In terms of the companion AI, it got the job done but felt they could die a little too quickly on higher difficulties, which often resulted in needing to fight the enemies alone and their presence being superfluous. They can be revived when using the inhaler, which restores your own health as well, but you'll also need to unlock a perk to be able to do that. I enjoyed the companions most when I was learning about each of their backstories and when being asked to help them with a quest. And that brings us to the different planets, towns and cities, and how it all comes together to create a larger part of the Outer Worlds. The story and the tales of the corporations and factions and how they relate to each other was well done, but the same can't be said for some of the world details, and I attribute some of these problems to the lower budget and being a smaller development studio. One of the game's greatest weaknesses in my view is the incredibly small populations of these cities that exist in the game. There are these sizable locations with large, intricate structures, and when the cities are spoken of, you would think they were bustling metropolises full of people, but they aren't. Each city and even the towns are made of several businesses or stores that the players can visit, but somehow these places can exist with the same handful of customers. It's like the whole city is home to a few dozen people only, and the problem gets forced home when most of the times they aren't doing anything but standing around. This sort of problem appears in other games such as the Elder Scrolls series, but when you have a game that is also trying to make certain political statements about the influence that large corporations have, these problems stand out even more. Then there are the load times, which are a performance issue, which I spoke about earlier, but they break up the world and its believability. The Outer Worlds is semi-open world, where it has several large open spaces which can be travelled between. When opening the map on your ship, you'll choose a planet and instantly be transported to it. Seeing the new planet, fill the viewing window of your spacecraft. It's impressive until you then exit your ship, and then comes the somewhat lengthy load screen. It at first gives an impression of seamless transitions, but it isn't. Plus, there are the load screens when moving between different areas in the same location. If an Outer Worlds sequel appears, and hopefully it does considering the success of the game, I hope these problems can be smoothed out, as it would only benefit the game positively. And on a side note, why are there planets on the map that can't be visited? Maybe they are placeholders for DLC, but it just gives the impression that players have more planets they can visit when they in fact cannot. Even though I very much enjoyed the Outer Worlds and was actually somewhat surprised by its final quality, I did feel that the longer the game went on, the less and less I was as infatuated with it. As mentioned, being a sci-fi RPG, then the likes of Mass Effect will come up, but the Outer Worlds keeps the same pace and mood throughout its whole playthrough, whilst never really straying too much from that. There are no large set pieces, riveting discussions between characters, or dramatic effects on characters or the world where you just sit back and take it all in. The story is well done, but when we compare it to Mass Effect, it never meets what made that series so great. But then when looking at lesser known Bioware titles from the past such as Jade Empire and Baldur's Gate, it just doesn't sit alongside those. It's an enjoyable sci-fi romp with a lot of fun to be had, but you'll be wishing that Obsidian get the chance to make a sequel with a budget and team size deserving of this new series.